Hello everyone, I'm so happy to see you all today. My name is Sue McGinnis and I'm the director of the UCSD Library's Academic Liaison Program. And I'm very pleased to announce or introduce this program, Marching Forward, Rolling Back, the Legacy of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Professor Widener will be our moderator today, and I will let him introduce all the speakers. Otherwise known as Danny, Professor Widener will introduce the speakers. And I would like to first thank, before we get started, the three people in the library who really pulled this all together and did a fabulous job in planning and coordinating this event. Rachel Myers, Gayatri Singh, and Dorothea Stewart. If you'd stand up and let us all thank you. With that, I'll thank you very much and hand it over to Dan.
Thank you very much. Do you need me to be mic for the sound? Everybody well, I haven't met him before, but these two next to me are pretty loud. So, and I am able to, such as this, think a little better if I'm not holding something in my hand, unless it's a beer. So I'm going to just talk. I hope that's okay. I want to also thank Stuart and everybody else, Gayatri from the library, for reaching out to me and to our other panelists, putting together this, which I think now is the second in a row that I've been involved with, so we'll call that a tradition here at UCSD. I'm happy also to say that having known Professor Childs and Professor Gore for some years, I can vouch for their political reliability and moral turpitude, which I could not say, unfortunately, about last year's special guest. If you don't get that joke, come back next year and let's explain it to you. Organizing people. As I say, it gives me great pleasure to introduce all three of our guests, and I would like to just take a minute to introduce all three of them collectively, and then I think I'll turn it over. Each of us is going to speak briefly, and then we're hoping to generate a dialogue with folks from the audience. I don't need this. Well, maybe for Professor Childs, Dennis Childs, comes to us from UC Berkeley, where he earned his PhD just a few years ago. And since coming to UCSD, he's become a really integral and recognizable part of that small section of the faculty that's really devoted to the success and experience of undergraduate students. It's also played a really immense role in helping to create a space for politics more generally on a campus that doesn't have, let's say, the best reputation, although it has a long history of student and faculty activism. As a couple of just short examples of that, I want to draw your attention to an exhibition that's currently in the library, titled Prison Nation, posters on the prison industrial complex. It's there till the end of the month. Split on both the ground and second floor. Well, the second floor is the ground floor, but also the first floor. So please do make sure, if you haven't already seen it, that you take a pass through. That's co-sponsored with the Center for the Study of Political Graphics. He's also the faculty advisor for a group called SAMI, S-A-M-I, which stands for Students Against Mass Incarceration, trying to link some of our campus students to the movement to abolish, again, the prison industrial complex. And that's part of Dennis's academic research. Explores the way that incarceration has served as a recurring form of restriction on the life chances, social mobility, and cultural development of African American people. And his book is forthcoming from the University of Minnesota Press next year. Excellent.
Slaves of the State.
Slaves of the State. So many of us will be teaching that, and for those of you who are students, you won't be able to escape having a copy. Professor Gore, Dale Gore, and I went to school together a few years ago. This has been a very bad winter on the East Coast, as some of you may know with glee. And so I was watching the Weather Channel, watching the snow come down and all the miserable people huddled around. and it said, "This is the worst winter in 18 years." I started counting back. That was when we started graduate school.
Do you have to put dates there?
Well, you know, it's professors. So, but Dale and I really know each other more than as student colleagues or people who work in the same academic field, but as activists. We spent some time in the late 90s in New York doing political work together, when she was very involved in an organization called the Audre Lorde Project. And Dale, I think, is a rare person in that she's able to do two things that elude, I think, most people with PhDs. The first of those is she has a real ability to transfer very complicated ideas that come out of the university into a language that everyday people can understand and can own and can access, which is a really rare gift and ability. And then secondly, her academic research really provides a long history of some of the most current thinking about the operation of race, gender, and class in the American context. And so she's really an invaluable resource for a person like me who sometimes struggles to convince students that anything that takes longer than 4 minutes to access, whether it happened before I was born, doesn't constitute ancient history. Then it says, wink here. I spent a little time in the theater, so I don't know if that's theater direction or how I'm supposed to introduce Dr. Wingfield Twyman, but he comes to us all the way originally from Chester, Virginia. Though he received his JD from the Harvard Law School.
Actually, University, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
You're right. I'm used to thinking in terms of the BA first and the JD.
Oh, no, we're fancy people.
We're fancy.
Everybody. He's
Oh,
taught
okay.
law here in San Diego. I'm actually really intrigued. He also was, is currently serves as an attorney with the National Labor Relations Board. One of the things that Darren and I were involved in a little while ago. See, it's so long, I think, oh yeah. We were involved in what turned out to be the second major campaign and the first successful campaign to organize graduate students in a private university in the United States. And the NLRB under Clinton played an important role in that until Bush came in, and then the NLRB played an important role in undoing that. But Dr. Twyman is at work currently on a novel set in the 19th century that trades on questions of race and slavery. He obviously has an experience of having grown up in the South at that critical transition point. So in both his intellectual expertise and personal experience, it's really an ideal candidate to talk with us about precisely this question of going more forward in that. So with that, we'll open it up, I think, first with you, and we'll go from there.
And just, how long should we go? Each about 5?
5, 7.
Okay. Well, I want to reiterate what Danny said in the beginning and just thank the UCSD library staff for bringing us all together, and particularly Dorothea Stewart, Gayatri Singh, and Rachel Myers for all the work that they have done in putting this event on. I think we need more such events and more such convergences. So I just really want to say again that I appreciate that work a lot, and appreciate also the invitation to be on such a distinguished panel. And also just thank everyone for coming out. It's a beautiful day to be at the beach here in Winter's Night in San Diego, so thank you. In terms of those that convened this event, I thought it was really, one of the things that made me accept the invitation to come to this kind of event that is in the kind of, general vein of commemoration, which I have a real problem with in terms of the civil rights movement. Commemoration can kind of give you the kind of feel that we're thinking of something that is in prehistory, as Professor Widener was just saying. The movement as being something that is dead, that we can kind of embalm as something to study, kind of like in a form of like cultural anthropology. But those of us that are familiar with what's going on in the U.S. and with the U.S. empire as its tentacles reach out across the globe, both in terms of spectacular violence of warfare, but also the more banal forms of violence that the U.S. Kind of form of economy and under racial capitalist and misogynist system that the U.S. kind of exports around the world. We know that we cannot embalm anything that happened in the 1950s and before and through the 1960s and 70s as something that is past. So that phrasing of marching forward and rolling back, I really appreciate. And I appreciated that even there was a cartoon I think that Gayatri had sent along with the invitation showing like, there's this notion of like the idea that we passed into this post-racial moment with the election of a black man into the presidency. But this political cartoon that she passed around to the speakers kind of lampooned this notion of post-race. So it showed a series of black people murdered on the ground, and underneath these cartoons of people being murdered is the phrase, "Oh, that has nothing to do with race. That has nothing to do with race. That has nothing to do with race." And then it shows at the end like a black person getting a job, and it says, "Oh, that's just because you're black." So that notion of marching forward and rolling back, it reminds me even of the movie by Holly Karima, Sankofa, and the Sankofa bird having that, it's a bird that is flying forward, but also at the same time looking back and attending to the ways in which you cannot think about the present of what could be called racial apartheid in the U.S., de facto racial apartheid, without taking into account the ways in which that situation of catastrophe that we're living right now. I study the prison industrial complex and its relationship to chattel slavery, the way in which we cannot think of the now without thinking of the then. Rather than a kind of along the lines of a kind of liberal version of history that is really has a desire to have us all have amnesia, but also a part of that amnesia is for all of us to believe in this myth of progress. And that's not to say, I want to say, be clear that what I'm talking about is not to diminish the real sacrifices and hard work of those who struggled in the various civil and human rights movements that began with the inception of this as a colony of the British Empire. I think Professor Gore's work really does a good job of taking us even before the 1960s, the time that we kind of think of as when the movement began. And so I think that that's kind of what the way I want to kind of frame the talk is that it's not about diminishing that sacrifice. It's actually a form of respecting that sacrifice to attend to the ways in which the struggle is not dead. The struggle remains with us. I mean, all of us know the name Trayvon Martin, for instance. But not many of us know the name Ramarley Graham. How many of you, just a show of hands, know that name, right? Ramarley Graham, along with Trayvon Martin, were two of the 313 black people that were murdered through police and vigilante violence in the year of 2012 in the United States, which equated to roughly 1 every 28 to 30 hours murdered. Not just by vigilantes like Zimmerman, but by people who, on the side of their cars, it says to protect and serve, right? But Ice Cube had a line in his more political days, to serve, protect, and break the Negro's neck. That's kind of the framing or the way that the police are perceived in these communities, and not just the police, but the entire so-called criminal justice system. That for black, brown, and poor people and indigenous people amounts to a system of domestic warfare that we have to look at in connection to the system of globalized warfare that is reigning over the entire planet, specifically in North Africa and the Middle East by the United States right now. Through things like the technologies that are produced right here at UCSD, like drone warfare, right? Where somebody can pretend that they're playing a video game and be bombing wedding parties in places like Afghanistan and Pakistan, right? And the idea is that those bodies that are being obliterated are somehow less valued than the bodies that are here at home. And the same thing goes for those that are internal, that are treated as domestic enemies internally. Both those that are labeled or are officially citizens, and those that are branded as quote-unquote illegal aliens, right? So right here as we sit in beautiful San Diego in this wonderful gathering, there's anywhere between 45 and 50,000 bodies, migrant peoples in immigrant detention centers throughout the U.S., especially in the Southwest and going into places like Texas. Usually in 23 and a half to 24-hour solitary confinement. They're kidnapped from their relations and deported thousands of miles. And we have the pretty horrific distinction of now having a president of the University of California, Janet Napolitano, who was a part of one of the biggest deportation plans in history. Obama's administration now has the dubious distinction of almost having deported 2 million people since he's been in office, with our president of our university having done most of those deportations. So the idea of marching forward and looking, but rolling back, the way in which progress and retrogression are mutually constitutive in the United States. And when I talk about the United States, I talk about it in the context of being an empire of the Western Hemisphere and the globe, not the mythology that surrounds the United States that it promotes worldwide in order to rationalize the kind of violence, both spectacular and banal, that it does worldwide and domestically. So in the brief time that I have left, I was thinking there was an inaugural event for Black History Month that BSU put on that I thought was a wonderful event the other day. I was speaking to some local high school students from Mission Bay High School who traveled to campus to look at the Prison Nation exhibit. And there was a professor from San Diego State named Antonisha Elamine Shavers, who's a new professor at San Diego State, who's from Richmond, California, but graduated from SDSU and Temple. And she brought up this quote from Malcolm X that I just think is something that really encapsulates what I want to offer today. And I hadn't thought about it in a while. And that quote is, "You can't stick a knife in a man's back 9 inches and pull it back 6 and call it progress." But in the situation of in the context of the largest incarceration system since chattel slavery, which is the current prison industrial complex, we have to ask ourselves whether we might amend that phrasing. And it's beautiful in its poetics and its ramifications. And say that in today, if we look at it from the perspective of those that are entombed, and we know that we're in California, the most incarcerating state in the most incarcerating country in world history, right? That we can no longer talk about the knife being pulled back at all. It's actually being pushed further in and twisted. We know that over 2.3 million people are incarcerated in the United States right now, equating to roughly 1 out of every 100 adults in the United States. But this is not just a class-based system, because we know that the 2.3 million people all have one thing in common, or 99.9% of them have one thing in common. They come from a position of poverty. But 70% of those people are people of color. And almost half of those people are Africans in the U.S., Black people. If 1 out of 100 adults are in prison, 1 out of 9 Black men between the ages of 20 and 34 are currently incarcerated in the United States. And when I sit in classes at UCSD and I look, quote unquote, for the Black men, I don't have to look any further than the Central Valley in California. Places like Corcoran Prison or the northern border with Oregon, Pelican Bay. And so I just want to end with, and again, this is not, again, to diminish the gains of the civil rights that are commemorated with the Civil Rights Act and its 50th anniversary. But we have to remember that there was a Civil Rights Act passed 100 years before that. The Civil Rights Act of 1866. There was the birth of the liberal legal discourse of colorblindness and the supposed birth of civil belonging for people of color in the U.S. That, at the same time that was passed in 1866, you had the inauguration of the original post-1865 prison industrial complex, which was genocidal in scale. The convict lease system, you need to look at the work of one of our famous or most important graduates in grad school since, Angela Davis, who has tracked the way in which we moved from what she calls the prison of slavery to the slavery of prison. And right at the same time that the first Civil Rights Act was passed in 1866, you had the birth of the convict lease system, chain gangs, and prison plantations that were the fulcrum, the very foundation of the industrialization of a war-torn Southern economy. So why did we need another Civil Rights Act? So what this is about is the cohabitability or the mutual constitutive relationship between reform, liberal reform, and state repression and state violence. So just one last thing, you got to take a look at a piece that was put out by the Malcolm X grassroots movement called Operation Ghetto Storm, a report on the extrajudicial and judicial or legal killing of Black people in the U.S. in 2012, which is a re-signification by the Malcolm X grassroots movement in 2012 of a similar report that was delivered to the United Nations by William Patterson called We Charge Genocide in 1951. That is not being commemorated during Black History Month. So when you go look at those documents, you have to ask yourself why. If I had more time, I would read you some of the names of those 313 people that were killed. But I also want to mention the name of a woman that was killed near the border here in Chula Vista. Her name was Valeria Munique Alvarado, a Latina, a mother of 5, who was murdered by an off-duty Border Patrol agent in plain clothes, brandishing a gun in broad daylight outside of her car. She tried to flee. He murdered her. Okay? And this convergence of militarism at the border and domestic militarism through imprisonment is something that demands that we apply the lessons learned from the mass movements and also honor those mass movements that we're celebrating today by continuing the struggle. And I would say that you need to look at the hunger strike that happened last year of 30,000 prisoners, and look at the organization called CFAS, California Families to Abolish Solitary Confinement, Californians United for a Responsible Budget. You have to join an organization if you want to translate your righteous indignation about such statistics and such realities into real work that honors the past as we march forward. Thank you.
In between, Malcolm X grassroots organizations had a relationship to another organization called All African People's Revolutionary Party, which was founded by Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael. And Stokely Carmichael used to say to people, you have to join some organization because it doesn't really matter if you're a Muslim or a communist or a nationalist or a radical feminist, but if you can't find some organization that you agree with, then the problem is with you, not with the rest of the world. So I think it's really, that's an exceptional analysis that
Are we going to use no? Should I use the mic or no? What do you think? Yes. Oh, there's a lot of yeses. I feel the power of the mic. I'm going to try to use it. I actually going to use it at least for the beginning of my talk, because I want to read something that sort of resonates a lot with what Professor Childs has said. I feel like I want to thank both Dorothea, who invited me, and the 3 women who helped organize this event. I actually came to the first event, Civil Rights last year, was it? Which I regret. Only a small portion from my support of that event. I was new, so I didn't know politics in San Diego. But at that event, I was like, wow, who organized this? This seems great. And so I'm glad to be able to participate in this second event that is happening here. And hopefully it does mark a tradition. For those folks who know me and sort of the work I try to do on campus, I'm deeply invested in building intellectual spaces where we can have conversations not only about the intersections between the intellectual work that happens on this campus and how it actually shapes or should be informed by the world we live in, the struggles people face daily, and trying to sort of bridge that gap, particularly around African American history, which I see, I think, on a campus that's dominated in some ways by science, which I'm struggling with on a daily basis. Increasingly the need for these types of conversations, for people to come out and have these conversations and build community around that. Because I would second the idea that you need to join an organization, but I also would second the idea that you need to sort of participate in spaces that you want to survive, right? That they don't survive unless people come out and participate with them. So we can't complain, but if they don't whine, organize. I can bring out a lot of yeah, but I'm already dated, so I will. He started
content.
Yeah. So I'm just going to go all in dating myself, because I had actually a conversation with Dennis Childs maybe last week about, he mentioned this Malcolm X grassroots organization campaign, and I can remember when I started organizing in New York. I started organizing around police violence in New York City. Maybe people don't know it, but when there was a famous case, Haitian immigrant Amadou Diallo was assaulted by the police. And in 1999, I guess, we got together and we formed this group called People's Justice 2000, which, wow, so that's 14 years ago. Thinking about addressing police violence, right, and the ways in which police brutality so shaped Black and brown communities in New York City, and really trying to challenge that. And you fast forward 14 years later, and you still see many of the same organizations and people doing this work. but also having some victories, right? But also seeing the ways in which the state responds in very powerful and brutal ways, which I think we should take as the challenge before us, right? Some change is possible, but it's a continued struggle, right? That you can't no change is guaranteed. And I actually take that as the model in thinking about this marching forward, rolling back, because partly what this reminds us is that the struggle is not sort of given if you have one victory, right? You have to be able to work to sustain those victories. And that takes a sort of commitment, a persistence, and a sustainability, which we can talk about in the long term. So as a historian, I'm going to do a little of what I consider my work a historical work, but I think it really resonates with what Professor Childs was talking about. Because I want to start with a poem that was written by Beulah Richardson, who was a black woman poet and actress and activist. She's probably most famously known as the woman who was the mother in Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, if you've seen that film. Or she was also more recently in things like the Toni Morrison, the version of Toni Morrison's Beloved, as she played a grandmother. But she wrote a poem called Genocide, which was written in support of the petition that Professor Childs talked about, which was made in 1951. It was a petition to sort of recharge genocide that chronicled the ways in which extra-legal violence, criminal justice system could be seen as a form of genocide against African Americans, the term they used at the time, Negroes, in the United States. And so she was an activist and an actor and a writer during this period. In support of that, actually created poetry and plays and went and performed them to publicize this committee. And I just want to start with this this multi-act play, she called it, that was titled Genocide. And it starts with a description. Genocide, Part 1, mood, urgent and angry. Cast, voice 1, the Negro woman. Chorus, 10 children from ages 3 to 21. Voice 1, and my pain is unended, for this government's policy towards me is ever changing but unchanged. Look at me, I am living indisputable fact of American democracy, quote unquote. I am the Constitution unamended. I am the citizen undefended. Chorus, humiliated, insulted, betrayed, outraged. I'll not speak spite, but life. I'll not speak of spite, but of life. And to speak of life, I must tell of death. Now you must see that I am flesh and blood, chorus, and more than that. You must see that I am black, and because of that, a strange democracy has been practiced upon me. Say it plain. It kills me. By government policy, I am slain, maimed, slaughtered, lynched, framed. It kills me, this American democracy. It kills me. And I was reading that poem. She has several of them that I find very powerful, but I was working on a piece on Beulah Richardson when the Trayvon Martin decision came down. And it reminded me of this moment, and obviously I was on Facebook and everyone's having more to say about it. But it reminded me that this is a longer struggle than these moments we sort of experience ourselves. And also that in part, one of the things that I think we have to, or I think as a scholar, I really try to think about is the ways in which African Americans sort of as marginalized citizens, as sort of the citizen undefended, is a part of the foundations of the U.S. society and government, right? That it is part of sort of foundational to the building of the U.S. as a settler colonial nation, right? That African Americans came as slaves and were sort of the anti-citizen. And that has not been rectified. And to imagine that the legislation that has passed has rectified it, I think is to imagine that, is to erase sort of that really long and powerful history. And I think partly what I would argue in some ways is that we need to recognize the ways in which the historical exclusion of African Americans is foundational. And part of that means then that the struggle is not simply just reforming, but sort of altering, right? That it takes a deeper change than simply reform to actually undo that history or to sort of create sort of equality, right? And in part I think that very deeply and strongly, and I actually believe that. But I don't think that's a reason to give up hope. And so this is the second part of my argument that I think is central, right? Because I think some people say that and sort of the fight is over, what can we do, you know. But for me, part of it is then that the struggle is to continue making that history visible and making the U.S. accountable to that history. And that, to me, seems to be the struggle and why it's important in these moments where we have rollbacks, where we have legislation that does a little, limited guarantees or rights, that it's important to stand up and not allow that to be rolled back. Because I think those something like the 1964 Civil Rights Act, right? When people study this, it sort of ended discrimination or challenged outlawed discrimination against on race and sex, right? And when you look at the statistics, most of the people it helped middle class and mostly women, sort of through the EEOC and all of these laws. You can look at the sort of structures of that. But I don't think it's not important in a sense to hold those things as demands that we still fight for, right? Because I think we need to think about fighting for them, not because it's going to solve the problem, but it makes visible how these laws won't resolve the conflicts that exist, right? And I think about something like the 1965 Voting Rights Act that was sort of defanged last year through the Supreme Court decision, basically taking away the rights for the Justice Department to declare certain parts of the country sort of under their jurisdiction, right? But I think part of that imagines then that we have solved that problem, right? So I think that is the problem of what the rollbacks do. It's not that they somehow were doing such an amazing job, producing so much change, providing equality or access for folks, but it's rolled back in a sense in a way that imagines, as Professor Childs talks about, a post-racial society, right? And so I think in part, I try to hold two things in my mind. That in 1951, that poem I read you, she wrote, and it resonates today. It resonates in the sense of thinking about Trayvon Martin, Marissa Alexander, the criminal justice system, the ways that police operate in communities of color. We can see that. The ways in which it operates, dare I say, at this university. That we can see the ways in which people experience that sort of being a citizen undefended, right, in very profound ways. But at the same time, I think that we need to understand the struggle has to take multiple forms. And this is, I think, the two-pronged part to hold out. And this is why I actually really appreciate Professor Childs mentioning the Malcolm X Grassroots Organization, to think about how long they've been committed to doing this work, right, in multiple places for over 15 years, right? And that sort of persistence is what it takes to make visible something that had been built into the foundations of a society for centuries, right? And I think when we think about it as something that just starts recently, when we think about it as something that can be reformed through legislation, we really do an injustice to the histories of struggle of people before us, and we also do an injustice to the work sort of that we're doing, because we imagine, oh, this will change it, this is what will make it better. And I think in part we have to see those as incredible sort of strategies, right? But at every moment we have to keep in our minds this sense that this is a much longer struggle, right? So I will stop there.
Can I start?
Absolutely.
Oh, great. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Well, I wanted to start by thanking my friend Rachel Myers for the opportunity to speak here today. Rachel was nice enough to read my draft of my novel, Hope Springs Eternal, Rachel. And I'm glad I could return the favor by coming here today. Before I begin, please note that I'm speaking in my personal capacity as a civil rights baby, term I use. My opinions are my own and do not reflect the thoughts of my employer. So having said that,
I'm not sure my employer is
So having said that, I would like to start by asking for a show of hands. How many people in this room can tell me what the Green Book was? Good. I like that. That's good.
You don't mean Muhammad Gaddafi's Green Book.
I do not. What was the Green Book?
The hotel?
Yes.
Where you could, in the South, pass around to see where there was a place where you could stay without being harassed. Exactly. Before the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is our topic for today, traveling across the country was dangerous for African Americans. If we could travel back in time to the 1940s and the 1950s, we would all cringe. Yes, we would. All of us. Police departments harassed and punished black motorists for being uppity or too prosperous if they were seen driving a car, for example.
Many whites view driving a car as a white prerogative. The harassment can range from mind games to arrest to even lynching as extreme. In the case you suspect I'm exaggerating to tell a good story, consider that in 1948, a black driver named Robert Mallard was lynched in his brand new car in front of his wife and child by a white mob in Georgia. The mob saw him as being not the right kind of Negro, quote unquote, and the N-word rich, quote unquote. As the NAACP put it back in those days, would a Negro like to pursue a little happiness at a theater, a beach, pool, hotel, restaurant, on a train, plane, or ship, a golf course, summer or winter resort? Would he like to stop overnight at a tourist camp while he motors about his native land, seeing America first? Well, just let him try. Businesses across the U.S. refuse to serve African Americans. Black travelers often had to carry buckets or portable toilets in the trunks of their cars because they were usually barred from bathrooms and rest areas and service stations and roadside stops. Diners and restaurants rejected blacks. Even gasoline could not be purchased from discriminating gas stations. To avoid problems, African Americans developed the habit of packing meals for long car rides. Richard Kluber talks about this in his book, Simple Justice. Congressman John Lewis, someone I greatly respect, recalls how his family prepared for a road trip in 1951. There would be no restaurant for us to stop at until we were well out of the South. So we took our restaurant right in the car with us, stopping for gas and to use the bathroom, which took careful planning. Uncle Otis had made this trip before, and he knew which places along the way offered colored, quote-unquote, bathrooms, and which were better just to pass on by. Our map was marked, and our route was planned that way, while the distance between service stations where it would be safe for us to stop. Now, a postal employee in Harlem by the name of Victor H. Green decided enough was enough. Too many vacations and business trips were ruined by insults and embarrassments. I mean, how does one explain to one 6-year-old that she cannot eat at the children's diner in Atlanta because of the color of her skin? What lasting harm was caused when one's son was chased out of a diner in D.C. because of prejudice? Green decided he had to do something to give the Negro traveler information that would keep him from running into difficulties, embarrassments, and to make his trip more enjoyable. So from his Harlem community, he created the Green Book. The Green Book, as you said, created a directory of road hotels, camps, roadhouses, and restaurants that would serve African Americans. I mean, as you can imagine, the Green Book was an instant success with the black consumer. I mean, think Ebony Magazine or Jet Magazine. Within 1 year, Green was distributing his book on a national level. The motto on the front page was, "Carry your Green Book with you. You may need it." Later editions would carry the quote from Mark Twain, "Travel is fatal to prejudice." So now, imagine the year is 1949. We're traveling back in time to 1949. Imagine all of you, not just us, but everyone is black. Everyone in this room is African American. You want to soak up the sun and the surf in San Diego. Where do you spend the night? It's 1949, and you want to have a good time in San Diego. Mexico. That's a good answer. I like that answer. If you decided to stay in the U.S., where would you stay if you were black? Anyone? Any guesses?
Douglas Hotel.
Where?
Douglas Hotel.
Very good. She knows her stuff. The Douglas Hotel was recommended by the Green Book. That was the place to stay at 206 Market Street. If you want to see it, unfortunately, it's been destroyed as part of urban renewal, but it's a block. It's a block here. It's a block. That's right, Porton Plaza. So, but that was it. The Douglas Hotel. There were some other places, Simmons Hotel and the YMCA at 1029 C Street, but that was pretty much it. Now, let's suppose you're hungry. Your young family wants to eat after you've had some time at the beach. Where can you go to eat without any risk of insult or embarrassment? Any ideas? Where do you eat? Mexico, I like that. Let's assume you want to spend your dollars in America, in the U.S. Where do you eat? It's 1949.
Place on 28th and Imperial.
My gosh, She's wonderful. I love this woman. She's one. She would go to the Brown's Hostess Restaurant at 2816 Imperial Avenue or Sun Restaurant at 421 Market Street. But that's it. Got 2 places to eat. My God, I can't even imagine such a world today. And I don't want to pick on San Diego just alone. I don't want to do that. You don't mind. Only 6% of the more than 100 motels that line US 66 in Albuquerque, New Mexico, admitted black customers. Only 3 motels in the entire state of New Hampshire would serve African Americans as of 1956. That's just outrageous. And you know something? The Civil Rights Act of 1964 silenced that madness. There are many, many legacies of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but the most important element, I say today, was to outlaw race and color discrimination in public accommodations. The signs for color came down, the signs we catered to whites only came down, and you know what happened? As a result of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Green Book went out of business, to the joy and pleasure of Victor Green. Because his idea was that the day would come when we would not face those type of discriminations in public accommodations. Now, I want to segue to my memories, because I think I have a few years on my co-panelists, and I actually was born in Chester, Virginia, in the South, between Richmond and Petersburg, actually Richmond, Virginia. My life began in 1961. I have no memories, I just don't, of colored-only signs or for white-only signs. By the time of my first memory in 1965, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 had been passed. My folks lived in an insular black enclave, and they probably didn't have the money or desire to tour around the country. I recall no discussions in my household about segregation public accommodations, but that might have been because my parents were being protected. Because imagine the avalanche of insults that had accumulated in black families as of that time. So anyway, now I will say this. Can you hear me? Okay, I will say this. I have tremendous memories of public school segregation, but that would be a discussion for another day. I never knew of the Green Book per se until this week. I didn't, found it out in my research, and I find that striking given my deep interest in black history, and that I majored in the History Special Scholars Program at UVA. It confirms to me, and I suspect my co-panelists may differ, but it confirms to me the crazy, super duper, for lack of a better word, success of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 in changing norms and morals regarding race and public accommodations. So, we've traveled back in time to 1949. We've gone through my birth in 1961 as a civil rights baby, quote unquote. We've seen the 1964 Civil Rights Act pass and its changes. Now let's move forward in time. Legacy time. A legacy is something received from the past. The year is 2013. It's the spring. I'm a senior citizen now. I grew my gray beard to underscore the point for this session. What are the travel experiences of this African-American traveler today? All right, spring of 2013. It's time for that old college road trip. Yes, it is. My oldest son's applying to college. I rent a car for the long trip up to the Bay Area and back. We pack snacks because we want to save money, not because of a Jim Crow world. We drive up to 5 through Orange County and Los Angeles. Got a late start, so we're traveling at night through Ventura County and on up the coast to Santa Barbara.
You got pulled over by a cop.
Nope, sorry. Let me add that my father-in-law is a cop. He was a New York City police officer, so that informs my perspective. But let me continue. So we check into this place in Santa Barbara, best breakfast place in Santa Barbara. While we're there, my oldest son meets Bruce of the Beach Boys. He shares breakfast with Buzz. Cool moment, very cool moment. Hit the road again, travel to San Francisco, visit University of San Francisco. A black tour guide shows us this college and tries to sell my son on it. It's a beautiful city. We drive across the Golden Gate Bridge. We frolic in Sausalito. Spend the night in Danville, one of the most affluent communities in the state. Stay at the Best Western Inn. My oldest son roams around town, convinces me to have dinner at this vegan place. We do. He concludes it's too hippie. We then cruise down to UC Berkeley, have lunch at a football-themed restaurant, then it's off to Stanford, We eat dinner at this upscale restaurant that caters to venture capitalists and Silicon Valley types. The boys love the place. We get a late start. I have to crash. We find some hotel in the middle of nowhere. And then the next day we drive to San Diego. And there you go. Summer of 2013. Experiences of an African American traveler today. My wife is taking the 3 kids on a road trip back east. They fly into the small town outside of Princeton, New Jersey. They meet my wife's cousin Nancy, who has 3 beautiful biracial children. The next day they go to the big city, Manhattan. They tour NYU, Columbia. They drive to Yale. They drive to UVA. They dine at places on the road where they care. Never once in their mind. Never once in their mind does their race matter. And you know something, my friends? That is how it should be. That was the hope and prayer and dream of Victor Green back in the dark days of the 30s and 40s and 50s. And so, yes, it's not a perfect world. I speak to my co-panelists, but you have to say, as Victor Green said, there will be a day when the Green Book will not have to be published. It will be a great day for us to suspend this publication, for then we can go as we please and without embarrassment. Thank you.